Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to present the 1927 film, The End of St. Petersburg, directed by Vsevolod Pudovkin. This is one of the major films of the Soviet montage style of the 1920s, and it's one of the films that was made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. It's a major film in every way. It's epic in scope, and yet it has a human content at the center because Pudovkin always takes a hero whose life and conversion he will follow. We'll be talking about that and a number of other aspects of the film. For example, Pudovkin's ideas about editing and acting after today's screening. It's a pleasure to welcome back to City Cinematheque one of my colleagues from the university, Professor Stuart Liebman of Queens College. Now, take this opportunity to enjoy the scope and magnitude of accomplishment in Pudovkin's End of St. Petersburg. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see The End of St. Petersburg. As I said before, I think a major film in every aspect, and a film that some more than 70 years later can fill us with awe and wonder. To talk about that, and perhaps a little bit more specifically than that, we have, as always, a guest. It's a pleasure to have back on City Cinematheque, Stuart Liebman. Stuart is the Executive Officer of the Certificate Program in Film Studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center. He's also the Chair of the Department of Media Studies at Queens College, and among his many scholarly pursuits, he's currently finishing a book on the Holocaust and cinema. But you have many way stations in your life have to do with the great European cinemas of the 1920s. Stuart, let's start just with the sort of simplest of questions. The one name that people know now, if they know a name from the Soviet cinema of the 1920s, is Eisenstein. There are a number of other major artists. Obviously, Pudovkin is one of them. Give us a little bit of who was Pudovkin?
Well, Pudovkin was a man born, like all the others, in the last decade of the 19th century, and their lives are, they occur at the same time as the birth of cinema and the growth of cinema. However, they didn't all desire to go to the cinema at first, but the revolution itself revolutionized their own lives. Pudovkin was studying to be a chemist before the war. He was drafted, he served in the Russian army, he was captured, was in a German camp for many years, came out of the war, went back to studying chemistry, and then as the Civil War bore down on him and opportunities opened behind the lines, he decided that he really wanted to study theater. And he was very fortunate to come into contact with another great figure in this period, Lev Kuleshov,
right,
who was the first figure to really start a kind of film school. And he was very much influenced by it and began as an actor as well as a set designer before eventually becoming a director in his own right.
Indeed, those of whom in our audience have seen the film, The Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks, can remember that the evil antagonist, the Count, is played by Pudovkin.
Exactly, exactly. And he often played roles in some of his friends' films, and Eisenstein's films, for example. And he was quite a good actor, quite an accomplished actor. But he was also capable of organizing a script, was quite creative, and made some of the greatest works of the 20s in the Soviet Union.
Okay, now let's talk about the 20s, in this particular moment, 1927. What did the Soviet government do, because this is the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution? This film is part of a group of films, is that correct? And talk about that. Talk about this project in relationship to the projects, its brother projects, as it were.
Well, you know, Lenin had said early on that for us, the cinema is the most important of the arts, us being the communists, right, the Bolsheviks. And they had invested a great deal of money and were beginning to reap some prestige from the projects that had been seen abroad. For example, Pudovkin's own film Mother,
Right.
Eisenstein's film Strike, and of course Potemkin, the battleship Potemkin. So for the 10th anniversary of the Revolution, they wanted to celebrate in style, and they conceived of a series of rather large projects, not all of which were actually completed during the decennial year, sorry. And they included the film October, which was actually not screened until March of 28. But Pudovkin brought his script in on time, and it was premiered on December 13th, 1927, and received considerable acclaim. He had been criticized, perhaps, by other filmmakers, by the critics, especially the more avant-garde critics, as being a little too tied to the theater, a little too tied to telling a story rather straightforwardly, as in Mother. And I believe that this film he wanted very much to be a demonstration piece of all that he could do in cinema as a real montage director. Other films that came around this time that were important in celebrating was Vertov's film, The 11th Year, a great, great film. Again, it's the 11th year, was completed in 28, and but it have to be seen as one of a number of projects of similar scope and ambition.
Let's take a step back to one of the things you've just said at the beginning of that response, and that has to do with the importance of the cinema to the communists at the time of their takeover. One of the things that then followed in history is that then when their influence, or at least their model, followed in any number of countries for really more than half a century, that meant that other places were galvanized to develop state-run film industries as well. But the case in the late teens and early 20s is a seminal one. Why was cinema so important to them given those conditions? Why this investment in the cinema?
Well, literacy remained a problem. Russia in 1920 was what we'd call today a developing country. Vast numbers of people had been dislocated by the war. Vast numbers of people were peasants who initially did not have enough land to function. There were no schools. The Russian administration was extremely weak. So one way of reaching these people was through ironically through dynamically new means, technological means such as the cinema, and they would send out cinema trains with generators to show these films, and then they would have narrators to explain to the people exactly what the meaning of these films were, so that it was a very cost-effective way ultimately of distributing the message that they wanted to get across, that their government was solid, that they were behind the peasants, they were behind the workers, and so on.
Well, another one of the things that always impresses me when I look at these films and one looks into the background, the historical background, is the relative youth of all of these participants in this, and the way in which, putting aside just for the moment the specific points of ideology that are part of the message, there is a whole social aspect to the overall project of being involved here. Not just converting people to communism, but what we're talking about is a lot of young people who believe they were improving their country in a very significant way, and who were given, in a country that was really quite poor and resource poor, they were put in charge of the most advanced technology available in the country for entertainment, propaganda, whatever, and were allowed both to take the message to their own people, but were also expected to gather an international reputation for their country through these works. And this happening most frequently with a group of people in charge with this who were under 30 at that point, or just around late 20s or early 30s. And one can really understand why they would have this great energy and enthusiasm. Such opportunities do not come along in nations very frequently for groups of talented, young, idealistic university students or graduates to be enfranchised in this way, to really create an industry, but to create an entire capacity to explain the origin of a new society to a people. Because one of the things about this is mythologizing the origins of the revolution and making sure that people understand this historical break. That 10 years ago we became a new people, and every country, we Americans have our George Washington and the cherry tree, name a country, and there are always stories of origin. And this is the chief means of really constructing that sense of historical break, but origin and change. Really quite remarkable project when we look back at it, whether we agree with the way it turned out historically, or whether we think they were fully informed, about what was going to come down the road very soon afterwards.
Well, I could say this, that they were enabled in this quest by the evacuation of the capitalist film industry that occurred right after the war and the Civil War. There was obviously no future for private enterprise of that kind, and the well-known talents of the Russian film industry left. That brought to the fore this younger generation, Eisenstein born in 1898, Kuleshov born in 1899, Pudovkin only a couple of years older, perhaps he was born in 94 or so.
Right.
So they were very, very young, and they attained celebrity, worldwide celebrity, very, very young. The state knew they had these young, idealistic, ambitious, talented young people, and they had the intelligence early on to back them. And this was at a time when the Soviet Union was very much in transition. There's no question that oppression already existed. This existed certainly from the time of Lenin. But that was carefully shielded from most people.
Yes.
The purges were still some years away. The active censoring organizations, though they were always active from the beginnings of the state, they were not as heavy-handed as they eventually became, and under Stalin.
Right.
So that you have this room for productivity and innovation that simply did not exist in later years. They were not cynical in any way.
No, absolutely.
They believed they were constructing socialism in a positive sense.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the specific goals of this film. What do you take it was the project as Pudovkin himself saw it, and how was he, by what means was he going to go about that?
Well, he wanted to dramatize the effects of the revolution. Old and new is a common trope in a lot of films of the Soviet period. What existed before capitalist, monarchical oppression, poverty, and so on would be transcended by the Bolshevik regime. And you find that elements of that in this film. Very often, Pudovkin wanted to dramatize those changes through the experience of one or a couple of people, in this case, a young peasant who's forced to go to the city and find work. He initially does something wrong against some countrymen of his in the city who are active in the political party, the Bolshevik Party. But he redeems himself. He converts to communism and to the fight for a transformation of Russia. Pudovkin's twist on this, in this particular film, had to do with dramatizing it through the landscape of St. Petersburg, which was the seat of power in Russia prior to the Bolshevik takeover. And as you know, the city itself changed its name from St. Petersburg, the founder of that city, Peter the Tsar, and also it was transformed to Leningrad. Only recently, post-decline of the Soviet Union, post-demise of the Soviet Union, has the city gone back to its old name. So he wanted to dramatize the history of the city converting over into a new future. And he did so by some really extraordinary montages of the city. These are highly edited sequences that dramatize different aspects of life, not only on the farm, but also in industry, and then also in the shape of the city itself. And he's extremely aware, as most educated Russians would be, of the example of Pushkin and Biely, the writer who wrote a novel, Petersburg, one of the great Russian novels of the 20th century. In that, the Tsar's statue, the horseman you see, is a very potent image in some Pushkin poems and in Biely's St. Petersburg. So you have sections of the film that are entirely devoted to describing in poetic terms by various angles, rhythms, and so on, this particular image.
One of the things, Pudovkin differs, obviously, from his friend and rival, Eisenstein, in his conception of how to stage, and I'm talking now actually about the construction of a script, how to stage this kind of mammoth historical event. I think one of the things you're pointing out is that we have an individual whose fate we follow, and we also have a city. Now, mind you, there are many shots in this film of large crowds of people doing things, watching, whether it be trading at the stock exchange, etc. But there's a way in which in Eisenstein, the crowd itself becomes a kind of protagonist. Here, the crowd seems to be part of a city that's going through a conversion. I guess what I'm saying is that we have the individual and we have the city. We don't have that same sense that we get in Eisenstein of the mass or the people, in some sense, being the protagonist. For me, that's one of the very different aspects of the textures of the film. There are other great differences between these two very distinguished artists, both. But it's also a little bit easier to explain Eisenstein than it is Pudovkin, because Eisenstein, you say, oh yes, mass society takes the mass as the protagonist, whereas Pudovkin would seem, in one sense, not to fit in, because yes, he has a conversion narrative at the center, but he also has a highly individualized protagonist, which really fits with the Hollywood model of how you perceive history. You perceive history through the experience of characters you identify.
Well, he was a strong director of actors. As an actor himself, Pudovkin knew very well how to direct actors, and was always committed to kind of skeletal, at least a skeletal structure focused on a limited number of characters. In this case, played by Baranovskaya, who was the protagonist in Mother. She plays the wife of the organizer, in Bolshevik organizer in this film, and a very fine actress. So he would base his films on that, but he was very attentive to criticisms, undoubtedly delivered personally by Eisenstein and as well as other more radical critics, that he should not remain so closely tied to that armature, that basic skeletal structure of the story. Instead, he should make sure that each performance was broken down very, very carefully and analytically into what Pudovkin himself, in his own book on film technique, calls plastic material, that each shot would have a certain graphic charge, and that these individual shots should not be thought of as simply taking from reality, but rather shaping from reality, and then together, shaping reality, and then building together into an ensemble, a whole, an artistic effect. And that is very clearly evident in almost every sequence of the film. Most prominently, let's say, in something as basic as an explosion. You would think that filming an explosion in real time would be quite powerful. Pudovkin says no, that in fact that's only part of the process, that you take many different colors and graphic images and put them together into a much more effective, cinematically effective explosion. And that's true in all of the montages that punctuate the storyline that you see again and again and again in the film.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is that one of the phrases Eisenstein used, as I remember, was to describe that Pudovkin was building his films brick by brick. And that would sort of imply that it all adds up to a sort of dull building in some sense. And one of the things that impresses me as many times as I've now seen this film is the kinetic energy of the film, no matter what kind of action is being portrayed, whether it be something like the stock exchange scene, or whether it be something like the revolutionary movement, or whether it be one of the intimate scenes. I mean, Pudovkin may have had his origins in theater, and like all of these directors, he was very interested in the ways in which the American cinema had begun this process. I mean, obviously Griffith being the leading character in saying cinematic properties are different from theatrical properties. We must find out what the cinematic properties are. And I find, there's a way in which you could take Pudovkin, and if you take a contemporary film student and you say, if you are looking at situation comedies and you think that's the way to shoot effectively conversations among characters, what I want you to do is watch this silent film and see how Pudovkin dynamizes space while maintaining a continuity in the scene that could very easily translate over into the sound era, because this sense of the plasticity of the image as well as the appropriate rhythmic alternation of images is so strong. But at the same time, with the same person, you could say, okay, so you don't believe anything about communism, and you don't even know what the Bolshevik Revolution was, but you've got an epic story set in outer space here, and you have a scene in which you have to have a bunch of people rushing in a certain way. I'll give you a film that will show you how to create the appropriate sense of urgency and kinesis about that.
Well, again, the stock exchange scene, the way I see it, is very much related to Eisenstein's famous scene on another set of steps in Odessa, in the Odessa step sequence in Battleship Potemkin. Pudovkin was someone who was perhaps a little insecure, and he was certainly patronized by Eisenstein in a certain way. He and Kuleshov, his teacher, were patronized by Eisenstein, who was the greater intellect, certainly. But he was always eager to learn, always eager to experiment. He was an apt pupil, which is not to say that what he did was in any sense derivative of Eisenstein.
Okay,
there were moments where he clearly aped or tried to learn from him, but there was also something different. There was certain lyrical intensity that Eisenstein, for the most part, did not do, with few certain exceptions. And in some ways, he preceded Eisenstein's own foray into a more linear narrative in the film called Old and New, where he did have a central protagonist. And Pudovkin, in some ways, showed him that you could be both cinematic and have a kind of ongoing storyline, and that they weren't inconsistent.
Well, this brings up a point about the 20s as a whole that we could then expand from the Soviet avant-garde to other avant-gardes. And there seem to be particular moments in film history in which there's, in the best sense, a struggle over what will constitute cinematic form. And one of the key issues in all of those struggles is always what constitutes story and story's relationship to the cinema. Is story something that appropriately should be jettisoned by the cinema in pursuit of cinema's own inherent properties? Or is story something that should be adapted to cinema to appropriate cinematic story forms? We're in an era right now in which you go to one of our superstores, Barnes & Noble or Borders or whatever, and you go to the section on how to become a filmmaker and write a script, and everything is laid out in a particular, you must have 3-act model, you must do this, your characters must show their motivations at this particular moment. And I think it's so refreshing to see these films made 70 years ago in which those concepts are being contested with such force and with also such creativity, with pushing this way or that way. Can the crowd be the protagonist? Can the city be the protagonist? Can we somehow make a film that's not so much about psychological identification with the protagonist, but it's really about ideological identification with the protagonist? We don't need to know all of his, deep feelings. He doesn't need to go on Oprah and talk, about his abuse as a child and how that made him a communist. No, there are other ways to organize, and essentially the fight among these filmmakers, or the tensions between them, is part of this wider debate in the avant-garde of the 1920s that we can see in different ways in French Impressionism and German Expressionism over the status of each of these elements in the cinema.
Sure. You were right to highlight the debt that Pudovkin owes to Griffith, because he, in his own personal mythology, dates his conversion to cinema from the time that he saw Intolerance, which was shown relatively early in the Soviet Union and actually before Birth of a Nation. And that film was absolutely crucial, and in his writings he talks about a number of films, for example, Tolerable David by Henry King.
Right.
Number of films that were very, very important insofar as they showed him how to break down the action, to recompose the action, and to streamline and essentialize the action. That was very important. Then over and above that, there is something that Pudovkin shares with the entire generation who came of age in the 20s and who were making films, and that has to do with the plasticity of the imagery. The sharp contrasts of plastic form become one of the essences of cinematic language as they regarded it. And then the rhythm, the pace of which those images were changed, which would edge into meaning, not simply hit you over the head and tell it in the old-fashioned theatrical way. That was their kind of grounding point. And then they would differ on nuance, questions of nuance, things that were crucial to Vertov, that things not be shot as if in a theater, whereas Eisenstein insisted that they could be, and Pudovkin clearly would agree with Eisenstein on that point. The degree to which montage could float free of narrative, and the nature of the story that's told. I mean, Vertov makes his most famous film, The Man with a Movie Camera, A Day in the Life of a City. Right. Well, Pudovkin is making a kind of period in the life of a city, St. Petersburg. Eisenstein wanted to make a film very much like this in the 30s called Moscow, the history of Moscow over a period of time. Interesting enough, he wanted to use the scriptwriter in this film, Natan Zarchi, for that exercise. But it was a difference in degree, not, and in some cases kind, but it was mostly in degree, the way I read it.
Okay, and these are people who are also highly influenced by the other art surrounding them. Just for a second, about there's of course the great moment of Russian constructivism in architecture and in the visual arts.
Well, you see this very, very frequently in this film. For example, the scenes in the factory, the montage of the factory with all the cranes and different industrial machines. This is a taste that is distributed throughout the 30s. If you think of Léger's Ballet Mécanique and other films made in France at the time, certainly many of the famous films like Strike, which occur in a factory in Russia, this is very fascinating to them.
We have come remarkably enough to an end of this 30 minutes. I think there's a lot more to explore, and I hope this will lead our audience to continue thinking about these issues. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, drop us a note. Drop it to City Cinematheque, City University Television, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. Let me give you that information again. Drop us a note to City Cinematheque, City University Television, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. Stuart, thanks as always for joining us here.
Pleasure always to be here, Jerry.
Okay, look forward to seeing you again. And I hope you'll join us again as we continue to explore the highways and the byways of film history here on City Cinematheque. Thanks for joining us today.